Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dr. Penny Dacks, AFTD Senior Director of Scientific Initiatives. This next session will be a fireside chat, and I will be joined by Dr. Chiadi Onyike, Associate Professor at Johns Hopkins University and Director of its Frontotemporal Dementias Program. Dr. Onyike is also a member of the AFTD Medical Advisory Council, as well as the Scientific Advisory Board for the FTD Disorders Registry, amongst many other leadership roles. We will be talking about FTD treatment development. What sorts of treatments are currently in clinical trials? How can we as a community help hasten their development and testing to bring effective treatments to care? This is, again, a fireside chat structure, so after we have a few questions teeing him up, if you have a question in the audience, please write it on a card and put it up, and a volunteer will come by to pick it up from you. And as well, anybody joining us online, please do submit your questions online. Dr. Onyike, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure.
All right, so first question. There's so much happening in research. Can you share some more about what's happening? What kind of hope is there that there might be treatments coming soon?
Well, I think these are exciting times. So much investment has been made, as you've heard in the earlier talks, particularly with natural history studies, also with the FTD Registry. Plenty of work in the basic sciences that has now crystallized into clinical trials, and there are a very good number of exciting clinical trials happening today. And it used to be that clinical trials focused on symptoms and how to make things easier. Now we are in an era where we're doing clinical trials with the objective of stopping the neurodegenerative process. And there are a number of compounds that have been designed to do just that. And you can see, for example, here, and these are trials that are focused on people who have hereditary mutations and exploiting a number of different mechanisms, focusing on trying to address the pathological cascades. You know, you could think of a cascade as a set of dominoes. You tip one and the rest fall. So we're trying to understand what the first domino is for each type of genetic mutation, and then intercepting that domino before it falls. And as you can see here, we have now a good list of things that are either actively in trials now or are about to go into trials. So it's a very exciting time, and it's like looking at different kinds of mechanisms.
So you mentioned that a lot of these clinical trials, and certainly the slide shows that most of them are for familial FTD. Can you talk a little more about why is it that so many of the trials are really focusing on people who have genetic variants, and will we learn anything from those trials that could help other families as well?
Firstly, I should say that the trials are not all the trials are focused on familial FTD, but I'll get to why there's a focus on familial FTD first. There's a focus on familial FTD because in these trials we know exactly what the genetic underpinning is. We know exactly what the pathology is. Now, it's difficult, for example, working from the clinical picture. If you take, for example, behavioral FTD. Behavioral FTD, when I see a person in the clinic, they could have underneath that clinical picture either a tau pathology or a progranulin pathology. And beneath that, the progranulin could either be C9 or RF72, or it could be progranulin. I'm sorry, the TDP43 could be either progranulin or C9 or RF72. Now, we cannot easily in the clinic predict, or at least not reliably predict, if a person has a particular pathology because they have a clinical set of symptoms. So it's very helpful when you have a genetic mutation, you know exactly what the pathological state is. Now, as a matter of calculating the success of a clinical trial, it's very important to have one population to be confident that the people you say have a disease actually have it. If it's a mix, it dilutes your ability to detect clinical effects. So we have an advantage when we know that a person is a mutation carrier. Now, there is also the aspect of having to do these trials to stop the neurodegenerative process when it's early. Neurodegeneration can progress to a point where stopping it becomes questionable. So there's a premium on doing it very early. And the only way we can know who might be really at risk for developing symptoms before they do are the mutation carriers, at least today. We hope that biomarkers, and you heard a bit about that earlier, will eventually position us to do screening in the population where we can pinpoint who might be at risk, who doesn't carry a mutation. But today, doing these trials early, validating them early, requires that we do them in people who have mutation carriers.
Thanks. So can you talk a little more about some of the treatments and the types of treatments that are in clinical testing?
For the non-mutation carriers, you mean?
Sure, yeah.
So there are a number of other treatments beyond the previous slide showed you things that are essentially drug treatments, clinical trials. But beyond that, we haven't given up, by the way, on dealing with the difficulty of living with frontotemporal dementia. We also haven't given up on rehabilitation. And as you may have noticed in the previous slide, there weren't none of those trials focused on the tau mutation. And that's because we're not quite there yet. We have medicines that are addressing the tau pathology, but not necessarily from a genetic perspective. And so, for example, there are tau vaccines in trial now. There are studies looking at inflammatory mechanisms that will not necessarily be specific to any genetic mutation. And then there are things addressing symptoms, and there are things addressing brain connectivity. And as you heard earlier, it's also important to do work for the caregivers. And so there are a variety of clinical trials that are focused on interventions to build caregiver resilience, to build caregiver skills. And those often require clinical trials to validate them.
Sure. Yeah, there's so much that we have to learn about how to do that.
Absolutely.
So outside of clinical trials, can you talk about some of the important clinical research underway?
So you've heard about all FTD and the natural history studies, and all FTD isn't the only one. It's the one that's happening in North America, but you have very substantive natural history studies in Europe, in Australia, in Asia, in parts of Asia and South America. And the very basic thing we're trying to do here is to understand how FTD develops, before symptoms are seen and then afterwards. So how does it evolve? And this information, as Dr. Appleby mentioned earlier, is critical for developing treatments. It's critical in a number of ways. Firstly, to find ways to measure the disease progression and through that monitor treatment effects when we do clinical trials. Secondly, it's important to understand the molecular events that precede the symptoms, because if we're going to do prevention trials, we're not going to be able to measure the effectiveness of prevention trials on the basis of symptoms. We're going to have to measure them on the basis of those events that occur before the symptoms develop. And so what the natural history studies are doing is observing before FTD develops, observing the point of transition from no symptoms to symptoms, and from symptoms to dementia. And observing them not just on the clinical level, but on the molecular level, so that we develop biomarkers. So biomarkers that can help us with this diagnosis, biomarkers that can tell us who among mutation carriers are on the cusp of developing symptoms. And this information is being leveraged today in clinical trials. So it's a whole range of activity, treatment, but also discovery that will help us in the treatment effort, the treatment development effort.
Great, thank you. So I think we do certainly have time for some questions in the audience, and some have been coming in. One question was around the intersection of ALS with FTD, of how can we help ensure that the disease-modifying therapies being tested for ALS can also be looking at whether or not they can help people with FTD?
So if you look at this slide again, the trial that's happening at the University of Florida, which is the second from the bottom line, is really focused on ALS, but it's targeting mutation carriers. So there is certainly it is certainly recognized that it is important to have this cross collaboration and to leverage discovery from where it comes. The overlap between FTD and ALS is mostly at the level of pathology and genetics. Clinically, they're very different syndromes. But we can leverage discovery in the ALS field for FTD work, and we're doing that. And the ALS community is doing the same in the opposite direction. And in fact, a lot of what we know about antisense oligonucleotide therapies, and you can see an example from Wave Life Sciences on the slide, comes from ALS research.
Yeah. It's been, I think, really inspiring to see, certainly speaking to so many researchers on both the ALS and the FTD side, about how much many of them are eager to find ways to collaborate, and certainly on the advocacy side as well. There's some amazing ALS organizations, and we're looking for ways to help break through those silos.
Absolutely. Yeah. There's a lot of excitement today.
Yeah. So, we've been, again, talking about the genetic trials. So just to come back to this question about what will we learn from those that might help people who have sporadic FTD?
That's a terrific question. And I'll take us back to this slide. So in order to understand the events that happen before symptoms develop, we need to know who to enroll in the studies. And this is where mutation carriers are crucial, because we know that at some point, we know that they have the risk to develop the disease. We know that, unfortunately, since these mutations are 100% penetrant, it essentially means they will develop symptoms at some point. But that gives us the opportunity to follow and identify biomarkers that are relevant to the development of FTD. We look forward to a day when we can then take those biomarkers to validate those biomarkers firstly in people who have sporadic FTD, and that we expect will position us to do, for example, screening in communities to identify who is at risk for sporadic FTD.
Sure. So we also have a question on the experience of going through trials. So do you have any suggestions for how people can navigate supporting a family member whose research might make participating in research difficult, even though they'd like to be able to do so?
Yeah, participating in research is in a sense a burden. It's a sacrifice. For clinical trials, it can be even more challenging for a number of reasons. Some of the clinical trials are more involved. Some of them require, for example, infusions, and so there's a need to there's a higher risk for discomfort, for adverse effects. Mm-hmm. It's much more medical, if you will, than say an observational study might be. It's very important, as you heard earlier, to understand to have a high level of motivation, and that involves understanding the value of the trial, understanding what is to be accomplished. It's important to understand what it will ask of you, as you've heard earlier, what the burdens will be. If you're a family member who, a caregiver who's going to be helping, asking these questions of the physician who's making the referral, of the specialist, or of the clinical trial team when you meet with them, how are we going to be supported? Because there are actually also practical things that studies will do. Many of these studies now are willing to help with offset transportation. It is possible, for example, to spend a night in a hotel. So there are a variety of practical questions that it's very important to ask, and to ask them up front so that you understand what you're getting into and how you'll be supported. And as a caregiver, you'll often be better able to ask these questions than the person who actually has FTD.
And this is something that the FTD Disorders Registry is working very hard to. That's why those surveys are important, because part of it is to try to understand what are the challenges and the burdens of the people who may want to participate in research, so that can then be communicated to the researchers who are designing the clinical trials, who are designing the clinical studies, right? It's a way to really capture it from a lot of folks, even those that are maybe not walking through those specialized centers because they may live far away, but they still want to try to participate.
Absolutely. And today, there's an increased awareness within the researcher community about the importance of understanding the burdens, particularly for people who are disadvantaged. Mm-hmm. And so there's now a conscious effort to do studies to get clearer what the obstacles are and what the unique needs are, for that matter.
Well, do you want to explore that a little bit more? I mean, we have seen in research that there really isn't a lot of participation from a really representative group of people. Do you have any thoughts about how we can do a better job of making research a more representative exercise?
Well, there are a number of ways. Firstly, one has to speak to the communities involved to understand their priorities, because their priorities are not necessarily what we would predict as professionals. So that's a very important part, involving them as a community in shaping the questions, in understanding the barriers, and then also in being much more creative about how we support participation. Because if a person is disadvantaged, for some people, it's just to give an example, employment itself can be an obstacle if a person is on an hourly wage. So there are a number of barriers that we don't immediately see if we're not speaking to the community, and so we need to get more broad-minded about how we do these things.
We have another question about treatments for TDP-43. So it was noticed that one of the treatments that you spoke to was about tau pathology. Is there any treatments that people are developing related to the TDP-43 pathology?
I'm not aware of any treatments that are focused on TDP-43 pathology that are not also focused on the genetics of the...
Right, for C9.
Of C9 or progranulin at the moment. But I think we'll get there.
Yeah. And biomarkers for TDP-43 have been farther behind, right? Which is, I think, also not helping with the speed of that development. Would you agree?
Yes, this is true.
Yeah.
There's active work in the area too. But.
Yeah. So we also have a question about, can I participate in research that doesn't involve medications? Can you speak to that at all?
Absolutely. So going back to this slide, for example, we look at what I like to call rehabilitative interventions. To give an example, at Johns Hopkins, we have a brain stimulation trial focused on primary progressive aphasia. And this combines speech therapy with brain stimulation. And the preliminary results are that when you make this combination, the effects are more robust and they persist for longer. So the benefits of speech generalize beyond the areas of speech that were trained. And as I say, they last for longer. So that's just one example. There are others who are trying to do these brain stimulation protocols, but focused on other areas of cognition, focused on behavior. And then there are what I like to call psychotherapeutic interventions that are focused either on things that facilitate communication in people with primary progressive aphasia, or that are focused on caregiving strategies and other kinds of environmental interventions that can be helpful.
Yeah. Another question came in, can people participate in research in the US if they are not fluent in English? Some studies, I think, allow participation. It's hard to know specifically which studies. I don't know right now which studies specifically, but I believe many of the clinical trials, particularly the clinical trials focused on familial forms of frontotemporal dementia, have ways to allow for people to participate, but they're not necessarily. Not all of them do, unfortunately. The reason for this is that the clinical outcomes have to not be confounded. The clinical outcomes, meaning the questionnaires, have to not be confounded by language difficulties. But some do. Some are able to do testing in Spanish, for example, some clinical trials, and have been designed that way. Sure. Yeah. So where should someone go to find out more, to find out about the research that may be available to them in their area, the research participation opportunities?
Well, if you're close to a center, you can inquire, particularly if you're in the care of a specialist. The easiest, simplest thing for anyone to do is to go to the AFTD website and look. You could also refer to clinicaltrials.gov. It's a little harder sometimes to be clear as to which study is ongoing and which is not, because that information is not consistently updated, particularly when the trial ends. But if you do some combination of the above, usually you'll find what is happening. It's also important to participate in the registry. One of the reasons the registry has been set up is to facilitate the identification of people who are interested and are waiting for the opportunity to participate in these trials, especially if you're not close to a major center. And even if you're close to a major center, you may not have yet had the opportunity to signal your interest because you perhaps may be waiting to be asked or waiting to hear that there's a trial in progress. And if the trial is not happening at your center, then the question may not arise during your regular clinical care. But if you're part of the registry, and I know for a fact that many of the major sponsors of the new trials that are focused on, particularly those focused on familial forms, are in fact relying on the registry to help identify people who are interested. And part of the reason for that is these are rare conditions, and it's very important to give everyone an opportunity to participate.
Yeah. And I just want to clarify one piece for that, because with the registry does not give out anybody's identifying information, right? But they'll send targeted information about a research opportunity to the person in the registry. So it's not that their data is going to be released to the companies or to the academic researchers.
Absolutely, that is true.
Yeah. Is it ever too late in progression to participate in a study?
Yes and no. Most of the trials that you see on this list are looking at early FTD, but there are trials that are focused on later stages, stages where it's important, for example, to address the symptoms. So the FOXY study, which is the trial of oxytocin, and for reducing apathy and improving empathy in frontotemporal dementia, is enrolling people who are in a more advanced stages. We were involved, along with the group at Columbia, in a trial with lithium, and that was focused on agitation. In this case, it's labeled here as focusing on neuroprotection because there are people looking at that approach, but we were more interested in the behavioral aspects of it. Mm-hmm. So trials that focus on ameliorating symptoms, reducing symptoms, improving function, are enrolling people who are in more advanced stages. There comes a point where it's so severe that it may be very difficult to participate, and that's largely because this is a data collection exercise, because we are trying to demonstrate that these treatments work so that we can then disseminate them to everyone. And if a person is not able to do the tasks, then it's impossible to show on the basis of their data that the treatment works. And so there's a limit to how late a person can be in the disease to be able to participate.
Sure. So we have another question that's kind of on the other side of that spectrum. So what if there's really no diagnosis yet? What if somebody maybe is having to have a little bit of symptoms and maybe a brain imaging scan, but they haven't actually gotten a diagnosis, their disease hasn't progressed to that point that there's certainty of that? Or on the other hand, perhaps if somebody is known to have the genetic, maybe they're a carrier of the gene that they think but they don't yet have symptoms emerging. Are there clinical trials available to them?
The clinical trials today are the ones focused on the genetic mutations are actually interested even in people who don't yet have symptoms. But one of the challenges is the timing. If you don't have symptoms and you're not going to have symptoms for the next 10 years, for example, then that makes it difficult to measure the effects of the drug treatment. This is where the biomarkers become very important. You heard earlier from Dr. Gendron about the neurofilament. Neurofilament is now being applied in clinical trials to allow us to tell the window, or to identify people who are close to that window where they'll go from being being non-symptomatic to symptomatic. And neurofilament levels begin to rise when people are making that transition. And so that allows you to say, for example, we are interested in enrolling people who have a mutation and also have a certain neurofilament level. Mm-hmm. And that gives us a chance to know that we're enrolling people for whom we'll be able to demonstrate drug effects.
Sure. But so just to make sure I understand this, so people who do not yet have symptoms but are genetic carriers are not really going to be eligible for clinical trials at this point, but they could be in the future, we hope. But they are eligible for, say, all FTD. Does that allow them to participate?
Well, let me make sure. Let me restate it. If you have a mutation, if one is a mutation carrier, one might be able to participate if one is close to that window, and we will know they're close to that window based on their neurofilament profile. And so you could still be eligible to participate if you're a mutation carrier, but not if your neurofilament levels are normal.
Thank you. Okay. So we've had a few questions about tau and Alzheimer's disease and FTD, right? So Alzheimer's disease has a lot of tau. We hear that a lot with that disorder. we hear with FTD. Can you talk about whether or not the research on tau in Alzheimer's disease is going to be applicable to FTD?
Absolutely. So looking back again at the slide, you can see the AADVac1 is an anti-tau vaccine. It's largely been developed in the Alzheimer's disease world. It's being tested there. It's also lately being tested for FTD as well. There are a number of other tau, there are many other agents that have been developed for tau that are being explored for frontotemporal dementia. Some have already been tried. Unfortunately, they were not successful. And there are others that will probably come to trials in the FTD space. So this cross-collaboration is very important. We mentioned earlier FTD and ALS, but also FTD and Alzheimer's disease. There are commonalities that there's increasing awareness in the research community, even in the Alzheimer's disease community, of the importance of cross-collaboration in order to make sure that discoveries in one area are used to benefit everyone.
Sure. So another question came in after we touched on TDP-43 to ask why are modifying treatments and biomarkers for TDP-43 behind that of tau?
It's proven to be a more difficult challenge. The technical details I don't know that I'm able to go into very well. I'm not a basic scientist. But we will get there. We will get there.
Sure.
The discoveries with neurofilament, for example, have to a large extent come from the FTD research. And a lot of that was fueled by the discovery of the C9 mutation. So we believe that in time we will find a biomarker that serves that purpose.
Well, thank you to everyone who submitted a question, and thank you to Dr. Onyike for everything that you're doing to improve the lives of people with FTD.
Thank you.
I have just one last question. What are the different ways that someone in our community can be a part of accelerating progress? Can you just give some of that breadth?
Well, so there are a number of ways to do this. Ultimately, it's, participating in some way. If you can't participate in the research, you can perhaps help make sure that other people are aware of the research. To participate, it comes down really to participating in clinical trials, in the natural history studies. Some people are skeptical about natural history studies or observational studies because it doesn't involve treatment. Well, this is setting this stage for treatment. Without the biomarker information that comes from these studies, we would be hamstrung in our ability to measure, to develop treatments. We would be limited to the clinical window, and really, ultimately, the holy grail is prevention. We need to prevent symptoms. We need to prevent molecular changes from becoming symptoms, and that's how we'll prevent handicap. And then the registry, participating in the registry allows us to know that you're interested, that you're engaged, that you would like to help this effort.
And you can do so from the security of your own home, which was another question. Most research studies require you to travel. The registry is a nice starting point to you can do from your home.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
We are going to transition then. So at this point,
Thank you.
I will turn things over to the AFTD CEO, Susan Dickinson.